It was a quiet afternoon in a small southern town, the kind of day where the air feels still and time moves a little slower. The sun hung low, casting a soft golden light on the narrow streets lined with oak trees. An elderly black woman named Mrs. Coleman was driving home from the grocery store, her old beige sedan humming gently down the road. She wasn't in a hurry. She never was. Her hands gripped the steering wheel gently, the same way she had done for years. The back seat was filled with brown paper bags holding fresh vegetables, bread, and the small bag of cat food she always bought for the stray cats that waited near her porch every evening. Her car wasn't in perfect shape. The taillight on the left side had been broken a week ago, when a careless driver backed into her in the parking lot. She meant to have it fixed, but she lived on a small pension, and repairs had to wait. She had been careful not to drive at night, thinking it would be fine for a few days. As she turned the corner near the post office, she noticed flashing blue lights in her rearview mirror. Her heart skipped a beat. She pulled over slowly, not out of guilt but out of habit. She had lived long enough to know what could happen if you didn't. A patrol car stopped behind her and a young officer stepped out, his boots hitting the pavement with sharp, heavy steps. His name was Officer Daniels. He had only been on the force for 3 years, still carrying that mix of pride and arrogance that comes with a new uniform. He walked up to her window and knocked hard, startling her. She rolled the window down halfway. Her voice came out soft and polite. "Is something wrong, officer?" His tone was harsh, impatient. "You've got a broken taillight, ma'am. You realize that's a violation?" Mrs. Coleman nodded calmly. "I know, sir. It just happened a few days ago." He interrupted her, raising his voice. "You know, that's not an excuse. You can't just drive around like that and think it's fine. Some people think the rules don't apply to them." She blinked, her hands tightening slightly on the steering wheel. The way he said "some people" wasn't about traffic rules. She'd heard that tone before many times over the years. "I understand, officer," she said softly. "I plan to fix it as soon as I can." But Daniels didn't want to listen. His irritation grew with every word she spoke. He leaned closer to the window, his voice sharp and accusing. "You could have caused an accident. You should be more responsible. You think just because you're old you can do whatever you want?" She looked up at him, her eyes tired but steady. She didn't raise her voice or argue. She had learned long ago that sometimes silence said more than words ever could. He sighed heavily, muttering something under his breath as he stepped back to check her license plate. People nearby began to notice. A woman walking her dog slowed down, pretending not to watch, but she couldn't help looking over. A man from the gas station across the street paused mid-step, frowning at the sight of the officer's raised voice and the old woman's stillness. Inside the car, Mrs. Coleman sat quietly. Her heart was steady, but her mind drifted. She remembered other moments, different uniforms, different faces, same tone. She had been through far worse than this. Daniels came back, waving his notepad. "You've been driving for how long with that broken light? You know you could get a fine for this. Maybe even a citation." She started to respond, but he cut her off again. "Do you even realize how dangerous this is? You people never take things seriously until it's too late." That last phrase hung in the air. She heard it clearly, and so did a few of the bystanders. A couple across the street exchanged glances. One of them muttered under their breath. Daniels noticed them watching and straightened up, pretending to adjust his belt. Mrs. Coleman turned her eyes toward him again. For a moment he looked down at her, an old woman sitting behind the wheel of a worn-out car, her face lined with years of experience he didn't understand. Then she spoke, her voice so calm it almost startled him. "You sound just like him." Daniels froze. The words hit him harder than he expected. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice quieter now. She looked straight ahead, her hands resting gently on the steering wheel again. "You sound just like him," she repeated softly. He frowned, confused and a little defensive. "Who are you talking about?" But she didn't answer. Her eyes seemed far away, as if she were looking at something beyond him, something from a time long gone. He stood there for a moment, feeling oddly uneasy. Her tone hadn't been angry or bitter. It was filled with something else, something heavier, like disappointment mixed with sadness. Daniels cleared his throat, trying to shake off the feeling. "I'm giving you a warning this time," he said quickly, writing something on the notepad just to fill the silence. "Get that light fixed. Next time it won't just be a warning." She nodded slowly. "Thank you, officer." He tore off the slip of paper and handed it through the window. As he did, he couldn't help but notice her hands. They were thin, trembling slightly but steady enough to take the paper without hesitation. He saw the small silver ring on her left hand, worn and scratched but clearly precious. He wondered briefly who had given it to her. He stepped back and walked to his patrol car, but before getting in, he looked at her again. She was still sitting there, not starting the car, not moving, just looking straight ahead. For reasons he couldn't explain, he hesitated. Something about her expression unsettled him. It wasn't fear and it wasn't anger. It was something else entirely. When he finally drove away, the echo of her words followed him. "You sound just like him." He couldn't let it go. Who was him? Why did she say it that way? Back in his patrol car, he shook his head, trying to push it out of his mind. He told himself it didn't matter. She was just another old woman trying to get sympathy. But the truth was, something about the way she said those words made him feel exposed, like she had seen through him in a way no one else had. Later that evening, as he filled out his daily report at the station, he found himself writing slower than usual. The image of her face kept flashing in his mind. Those calm, knowing eyes that didn't match the fear or anger he was used to seeing during stops. He couldn't explain why it bothered him so much. Meanwhile, Mrs. Coleman finally pulled her car back onto the road. She drove home slowly, the sound of her engine the only thing breaking the silence. When she reached her small white house at the edge of town, she parked in the driveway and sat there for a moment, staring at the sky turning orange and pink with the sunset. She didn't cry or sigh. She just sat quietly, letting the day settle around her. After a while, she reached into her purse and pulled out a small photograph, faded around the edges, from her wallet. It was of her late husband in his police uniform, smiling proudly beside her on the day he was promoted. She ran her fingers over the photo, her eyes softening. "You sound just like him," she whispered again to herself, this time with a tone filled not with hurt but with memory. Inside her house, the air smelled faintly of old books and lavender. She set the groceries on the counter and fed the 2 stray cats waiting by the back door. She moved slowly but with purpose, like someone who had done this same routine for decades. As she sat down by the window with a cup of tea, her mind wandered back to that moment on the side of the road. The young officer's anger, his tone, the way he puffed his chest as if trying to prove something. She had seen it before. In her husband's colleagues, in the faces of men who once doubted his worth because of his skin. Her husband had spent years fighting that kind of hatred, and sometimes he came home so tired he could barely speak. But he never gave up. That's what she saw in the officer today, the same anger, the same blindness. But deep down, she also thought she saw something else hiding behind it. Maybe confusion, maybe fear, something he didn't even recognize yet. As the evening settled in, she turned off the lamp and looked out the window. The sky was dark now, a single streetlight glowing faintly at the corner. She whispered softly as if speaking to her late husband, "Looks like there's still work to do." And somewhere across town, Officer Daniels sat in his patrol car, parked by the side of the road, staring out the windshield, unable to stop hearing those 5 quiet words from an old woman who had said more in a sentence than anyone had said to him in years. That night, Officer Daniels couldn't shake the old woman's words from his mind. He kept repeating them silently as he sat in his small apartment, the dim light of the living room lamp casting shadows across the walls. "You sound just like him." The way she said it was calm, steady, almost gentle, yet it hit him harder than any yelling, any argument, or any traffic stop he had ever dealt with. He tried to tell himself it didn't matter. She was old. She was probably just referring to some man she remembered from long ago, but his mind kept drifting back to her face. The quiet way she had looked at him from behind the steering wheel, the way her hands had rested on the wheel without shaking. It wasn't fear. It wasn't weakness. It was strength. It was a kind of strength he had never seen before. Not in civilians, not even in some of the veterans he worked with. He couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned in his bed, staring at the ceiling. His patrol reports, his training notes, even his casual thoughts about work all blurred together. He kept thinking, who was him? Who did she mean? And why did her words make him feel small in a way that no one else ever had? The next morning, he arrived at the station earlier than usual. He parked his car and watched other officers walking in, chatting and laughing. He kept his head down, hoping no one would notice the strange look on his face. But curiosity gnawed at him. He wanted answers. He started quietly asking questions about Mrs. Coleman to older officers at the station. Some didn't want to talk. Some shrugged, giving vague replies about her being a quiet, well-known member of the community. But one of the senior officers, a man named Richards who had been on the force for over 30 years, leaned in and spoke quietly. Her husband, he said slowly. He was a good man. One of the best we ever had, but he had to fight a lot of battles inside this very department. Racism, corruption. He stood against it all. Daniels froze in place. He didn't know what to say. Her husband? He asked. Richards nodded. Captain Elijah Coleman. You've heard of him? Daniels shook his head. He hadn't. He was one of the first black captains in this town, Richards continued. Brave, honest, didn't let anyone bully him. Not anyone. And the woman you stopped, Mrs. Coleman, she's his widow. Lived through a lot, let me tell you. Knows people like you when she sees them. Daniels felt a chill. He thought about the encounter again. How she had said just 5 words and he had been frozen by them. He understood now why. She had lived through so much, seen so much, carried a weight that no officer today could imagine. He spent the next hour digging through old files in the station archive. Dusty reports, faded photographs, and yellowed newspaper clippings told the story of Captain Elijah Coleman. He read about the early years when the department had been dominated by men who didn't want to see a black officer promoted. He read about the threats, the lies, and the false accusations that had been used to try to destroy him, and he read about how Elijah Coleman had fought, not just for himself but for everyone who deserved fairness. Daniels closed his eyes and leaned back against the wall. The woman he had yelled at had been married to this man. She had been a partner in that fight. She had lived through harassment, through fear, through moments where the world could have crushed her, and she hadn't broken. He thought about the words again. You sound just like him. He realized it wasn't a threat. It wasn't an insult. It was an observation. She had seen in him something familiar, something that reminded her of people who had tried to intimidate her husband, to push him down. That one calm phrase had shown him more about himself than he had wanted to see. Daniels left the station early that day. He drove slowly past Mrs. Coleman's street, pretending he was just patrolling. She was sitting on her front porch, a light shawl over her shoulders, knitting quietly. A couple of stray cats circled her feet. She looked up as he slowed and nodded slightly. He didn't stop. He wasn't ready. He didn't know what he would say if she spoke to him again. For the next few days he found himself distracted during work. Every stop he made, every call he responded to, he kept thinking about her. He even found himself apologizing silently to strangers for things he had done, wondering if he had ever treated them with the same impatience he had shown Mrs. Coleman. One evening, unable to resist his curiosity any longer, he went to the town library. He started looking up old newspaper articles about Captain Elijah Coleman. He read about how he had mentored young officers, how he had fought against racist policies within the force, and how he had helped create programs for black youth who wanted to join the department. He read about the danger he had faced, the threats from men who had hated him simply for being black and brave. Daniels felt a growing sense of shame. He had been quick to judge, quick to assume, and quick to yell. He thought he was just enforcing the law. But now he understood that Mrs. Coleman, even in her quietness, carried the weight of years of courage and pain. By the end of the week, he decided he needed to see her again. Not as an officer writing a ticket, but as someone who wanted to understand. He parked a few houses down, watching her from the corner. She was still knitting, still calm, still unbothered by the world passing by. Daniels noticed the small details he had missed the first time. The careful way she sorted her groceries, the gentle way she called the cats to her side, the soft smile when she looked at the children walking by. He thought about stopping. He thought about walking up to her. But fear held him back. Fear of rejection, fear of judgment, fear of not knowing what to say. He stayed in the car longer than he meant to, thinking of excuses, reasons why he shouldn't approach her. But finally he decided he couldn't leave it. He had to try. He walked slowly to her porch. She looked up, her hand still holding the yarn. She didn't speak. She didn't frown. She just studied him, calm and quiet like she had done before. He began, his voice awkward. I wanted to apologize for the other day. I shouldn't have. He trailed off. She tilted her head, eyes softening just slightly. "I know," she said simply. Daniels blinked, surprised at how easily she forgave him. You know?" he asked. She nodded. "I've seen worse. I've lived through worse. You're just a young man who's still learning. Don't worry too much about it." He exhaled slowly. Relief and embarrassment mixed in his chest. He had expected anger, or at least bitterness, but she showed neither. Instead, there was understanding, quiet but firm, the kind of understanding only someone who has endured decades of hardship can give. They talked for a few more minutes. He asked about her day, about the town, about small things he usually ignored. She told him about the garden she was planting, about the new kittens she had rescued, about a recipe she was trying out for dinner. Nothing heavy, nothing about the past yet. But he listened carefully, soaking it all in, realizing that this was a person whose life had depth he couldn't imagine from a first encounter. When he left, he didn't feel the same pride he usually felt after leaving a traffic stop. He felt humble. He felt like he had learned something important, even though all they had exchanged were small words and polite conversation. That night, Daniel sat in his apartment again, thinking about Mrs. Coleman. He thought about her husband, about the history he had just learned, about the courage and quiet strength of a woman who had lived long enough to see the world change, but not always for the better. He realized that the way he had yelled at her had been a mistake, a moment of weakness, and a reflection of a mindset he needed to confront in himself. Her words echoed in his mind again, softer now but sharper than ever. "You sound just like him." For the first time, Daniels felt like he understood a little of what she meant. And for the first time, he wanted to change. Not for the department, not for appearances, but because he didn't want to be the kind of man she had seen so clearly in him. As he drifted off to sleep, he thought about visiting her again, about learning more, about trying to see the world through the eyes of someone who had faced injustice with dignity and courage. He didn't know how long it would take, or what he would learn, but for the first time, he felt like he had a reason to try. And somewhere across town, Mrs. Coleman closed her shutters and sat in the quiet of her living room. She didn't know that the young officer had started thinking differently, that her calm words had left a mark deeper than she could see. She only knew she had done what she always did, spoken the truth quietly without fear, and that sometimes that was enough. Days passed after Officer Daniels' first quiet visit to Mrs. Coleman's porch. He found himself thinking about her more than he wanted to admit. Each time he walked into the station, he imagined her sitting there knitting, her hands calm, her eyes steady, her voice gentle yet firm. He wondered about the life she had lived, the history she carried in her quiet way. The words she had said to him, "You sound just like him," were still echoing in his mind, louder than the sirens, louder than the radio chatter, louder than anything else in his day. He wanted to know more. He wanted to understand who she was beyond the old woman with the broken taillight. He remembered the senior officer, Richards, mentioning her husband, Captain Elijah Coleman. He had read the newspaper articles, the old files in the archive. Captain Coleman had been a man of integrity, courage, and compassion, who had faced dangers within the department and in the town. Daniels kept turning it over in his mind. Mrs. Coleman had lived through all that. She had endured hardships, injustices, and prejudice. And yet when he confronted her, she had not shouted, not screamed, not cursed. She had spoken calmly and truthfully. That had shaken him more than any yelling could. By midweek, Daniels realized he needed to confront his own behavior and ignorance. He decided to visit the library again, not just to read about Captain Coleman, but to learn about the community itself. He spent hours flipping through old town records, news clippings, and community stories. He read about the programs Captain Coleman had started, how he had helped young people, how he had spoken against unfair policing, and how he had stood firm when others tried to silence him. He learned that the town had not always been kind or fair. There had been tension, protests, and fights for justice, and Mrs. Coleman had been right there in the middle of it, living and surviving. The more Daniels learned, the more he felt the weight of his own actions. He thought about how he had assumed the worst about Mrs. Coleman, how he had shouted and judged before even considering her life, her experience, her knowledge. He realized that she had seen something in him the moment she spoke. He had seen it too, but he had not recognized it until now. Later that week, he worked a quieter shift. He was assigned to patrol the neighborhoods near the town center. As he drove slowly down the streets, he noticed people he would have normally ignored. A man painting his porch, a young girl walking her dog, an elderly couple sitting on a bench. He watched them carefully, not to judge but to observe, to learn. He began to notice small details. The way people smiled, the way they moved, the way they reacted to the world around them. He realized he had been blind to so much for so long. He also found himself thinking more about Mrs. Coleman herself. He wanted to visit her again, to talk, to learn from her. He wasn't sure if she wanted that, but he felt a pull he couldn't ignore. One afternoon, he parked a few houses down from her home and watched her from a distance. She was tending to her small garden, carefully trimming the plants, watering them with precision. A few stray cats rubbed against her legs. She looked up once and their eyes met. She smiled faintly, not a greeting, just acknowledgement. Daniels nodded to her silently and she returned the gesture. Finally, one afternoon, he worked up the courage to approach her again. This time, he walked up to her porch slowly, trying not to appear intimidating. She looked up, knitting in her hands, her eyes calm. She didn't frown or scold. She simply observed him quietly. "I wanted to thank you," he said, his voice soft. "For the other day, I shouldn't have yelled at you. I was wrong." Mrs. Coleman's hands paused in her knitting. She looked at him, her eyes steady. "I know," she said simply. Daniels blinked. You knew?" "Yes," she said. "I've seen many men like you. Some loud, some quiet. But I know when someone hasn't learned yet. You still have a chance to do better." Her words struck him. She didn't scold him. She didn't berate him. She spoke with patience and wisdom, the kind only someone who has lived through hardship can speak with. Daniels felt a mix of shame and gratitude. They began to talk slowly. At first it was small talk, about her garden, the stray cats, the town, the weather. But gradually she began to tell stories about her husband, Captain Elijah Coleman. She spoke about his work in the department, about the battles he had fought against unfairness, about the young officers he had mentored. She told Daniels about the dangers he had faced, the threats against him, the unfair treatment from those who feared his honesty. Daniels listened intently, realizing that the man she described had not only been a hero in uniform, but also a man of deep character and courage. He asked her questions, carefully, respectfully. She answered each one with patience, never rushing, never dismissing him. She spoke of how her husband had taught her that strength wasn't just about fighting, but about understanding, listening, and standing firm even when it was hard. Daniels felt himself learning something he hadn't expected: humility. After a long pause, Mrs. Coleman said, "Do you know why I said what I said that day?" Daniels shook his head. "No, ma'am, I want to understand." She looked at him, her eyes soft but unwavering. "I said it because I have seen men like you before. Men who shout, who try to scare people, who think the uniform makes them better than others. I've seen that look before in my husband's time. I've seen it in men who thought they could intimidate him, break him, silence him. And that look. It's familiar. You had it just for a moment. That's why I spoke. To make you stop, think, remember." Daniels felt the weight of her words. It wasn't an accusation. It was a lesson. She had seen through him before he even realized what he had become. She had forced him to pause, to reflect, to see himself clearly. They talked for hours that afternoon. Mrs. Coleman shared stories of her life, of the community, of the struggles and triumphs she had experienced. She spoke of her husband's lessons not as history, but as guidance for living a life with integrity and fairness. Daniels listened, sometimes taking notes mentally, sometimes just sitting in silence, absorbing the wisdom of someone who had truly lived. As the sun began to set, he realized he had stayed longer than he intended. Mrs. Coleman stood, stretching her frail arms, and smiled gently. "You've done well today. You've listened. That's a start. Keep going." Daniels nodded, feeling a strange mix of pride and humility. He thanked her and started to walk away. But he didn't feel the same pride he had once felt after enforcing rules. This was different. He felt changed, not because of authority, but because of understanding, because of perspective, because of someone showing him the truth gently, patiently. That night, Daniels couldn't sleep again. But this time, it wasn't the same restless anxiety he had felt before. He replayed their conversation, remembered her words, her calm voice, her steady gaze. He realized that change was possible, not for the town, not for the station, but for himself. He decided to take small steps. He would start noticing people more, listening to them, trying to understand their lives rather than judging them quickly. He would try to see beyond appearances, beyond assumptions, and most importantly, he would think before he spoke, remembering the 5 words that had stopped him cold. "You sound just like him." Weeks passed, and Officer Daniels started to notice subtle changes in himself. He found himself speaking more carefully to citizens during stops. He tried to explain rules clearly rather than shouting. He noticed the young kids in the community, sometimes giving them advice or just a friendly nod. He even started volunteering for community events on weekends, helping clean streets or working at local youth programs. The small changes weren't noticed by everyone, but they were felt by him, and he felt the weight of them in his heart. And all the while, Mrs. Coleman continued her life quietly, unaware of the full impact she had made. Her days were filled with her garden, her knitting, and caring for the stray cats, but she remained a guiding presence for the young officer. Even a glance from her window, a small smile or a soft word, reminded him to keep trying, to keep learning, to keep being better. Daniels realized that this was more than an apology or a lesson. This was a path forward, a chance to live and work with integrity, inspired by someone who had lived through hardship and carried her wisdom forward with quiet strength. And so, as the nights grew longer and the sun dipped below the horizon, Daniels found himself changing slowly, thoughtfully, and deeply, all because of the woman who had spoken just 5 words and had seen more in him than he had ever seen in himself. The weeks that followed marked a slow but profound change in Officer Daniels. He could feel it in small ways at first, the little shifts in his thoughts and actions. On his patrols, he began noticing the details he had once ignored. The way a child's laughter echoed down the street, the careful work of a neighbor painting their porch, the way elderly residents moved about the town with dignity, despite the years that weighed on them. Every face became more than a silhouette, every story more than an assumption. One afternoon, Daniels found himself at a busy intersection where a group of young boys played basketball on a cracked street court. He remembered the fear he would have felt in his earlier years, assuming mischief where there was none. But now he stopped his car and watched. He noticed the care in their passes, the joy in their laughter, and the way they encouraged each other. He lowered his window and waved gently, and a few of them waved back with big grins. He felt a strange warmth he hadn't felt in years on the job. But the lesson that weighed heaviest was the one he learned from Mrs. Coleman. Her calmness, her patience, her understanding. It wasn't passive. It was deliberate, a force stronger than shouting or anger. He found himself recalling her words often. "You sound just like him." They no longer felt like a rebuke but a reminder. A mirror reflecting the type of man he could choose to be. One evening, Daniels decided to visit her again. He parked a block away, not wanting to impose, but curiosity and respect pulled him toward her porch. She was sitting with her knitting in her lap, her shawl draped over her shoulders. The light of the setting sun painted her hair with streaks of silver, and her face glowed softly in the fading light. She looked up at him and smiled faintly. "You came again," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. I wanted to talk some more if that's all right." She nodded, gesturing to the empty chair beside her. "Sit. I have a few stories to tell." Daniels lowered himself into the chair, unsure of what to say next. She began slowly, recounting the years she had spent alongside her husband, Captain Elijah Coleman. She spoke of his dedication, not just to the badge, but to the people, to fairness, to the truth. She described how he would mentor young officers, guide them when they were unsure, and stand firm when others tried to intimidate them. Daniels listened, captivated by the depth of her words. "He believed in accountability," she said quietly. "Not punishment, but learning. Not fear, but understanding. That's what he taught me, and what I try to pass on in my own way." Daniels realized that she wasn't just telling stories. She was teaching him. Each word carried weight, a lesson disguised as memory. He felt the weight of his own behavior pressing on him. He thought about his quick judgments, his raised voice, the assumptions he had made about her in a few short minutes. He felt shame, yes, but also gratitude. He was seeing the world through her eyes, and it was sharper, richer, more compassionate than he had ever imagined. Days turned into weeks, and Daniels found himself spending more time in the community beyond his usual patrols. He began volunteering at local youth programs, helping children who needed guidance, sharing stories of fairness, honesty, and respect. He realized that change was not just personal, it was visible, tangible, affecting the lives of others around him. And each time he spoke to the children, he thought of Mrs. Coleman's calm voice, her gentle eyes, her quiet wisdom. One morning, a call came through the station. A complaint had been made about officers treating a young man unfairly in the neighborhood. Daniels arrived first. He saw the officer involved raising his voice, the young man flinching. Daniels stepped forward calmly but firmly and intervened. He reminded the officer to treat everyone with respect and fairness, to speak carefully and listen actively. The situation de-escalated quickly and the young man walked away without fear. Daniels realized then that the lessons from Mrs. Coleman and her husband were guiding him more than any training manual ever could. Back at the station, some colleagues began to notice the change. A few teased him, calling him soft or too careful. Others watched quietly, sensing a shift in the way he approached people. He didn't argue. He knew that change wasn't about approval. It was about being better, being aware, being responsible for how his words and actions affected others. One afternoon, Daniels found himself walking down the street where Mrs. Coleman lived. He had something important to ask her. When he reached her porch, she was watering her small garden. She looked up, smiling faintly as she always did. "Mrs. Coleman," he said, "I want to ask you something. About your husband, about the lessons he taught you. Can you help me understand more? I want to do better." She paused, wiping her hands on her apron. Then she motioned for him to sit. "Sit," she said, "and I'll tell you what you need to know." For the next hour, she spoke of her husband's dedication, his principles, the small ways he guided others, the courage it took to stand against unfairness, and the patience required to teach it. Daniels listened carefully, realizing that everything she said applied to him now, not because he was a new officer, but because he was willing to see, to hear, and to learn. "You must remember," she said finally, "that power is not in the badge, not in the uniform. It is in the choices you make every day, how you speak, how you act, how you see people who are different from you. That is where your strength lies." Daniels felt those words settle in his chest. He understood that change was ongoing, that being better was not a single act but a series of choices made daily. He felt a quiet resolve growing within him, a commitment to honor not just the law but the people it was meant to protect. Over the next few weeks, he began applying those lessons everywhere. During traffic stops, he explained calmly instead of shouting. He noticed the subtle cues of fear or confusion and adjusted his approach. He started talking with people in the community beyond his official duties, asking about their lives, listening to their stories, showing respect through his actions. Slowly, he could feel the difference both in how people responded to him and in how he felt about himself. One evening, while driving past Mrs. Coleman Street, he noticed her sitting on the porch again, a blanket over her lap, knitting by the fading light. He stopped for a moment and waved. She looked up, smiled faintly, and nodded. He returned the gesture, feeling a deep sense of connection, not because of friendship in the usual sense, but because of respect, trust, and shared understanding. That night, he reflected on his journey. He thought about the moment he had first yelled at her, the shock her calm words had caused, and the slow transformation that had followed. He realized that the change in him was not complete, but it was real. He felt humility, responsibility, and a quiet determination to continue. As he prepared for bed, Daniels found himself writing notes, small reminders of what he had learned, what he wanted to remember: patience, understanding, listening first, speaking last, seeing beyond the surface, treating everyone fairly. He folded the paper and placed it in his wallet, a private reminder of the lessons that had begun on a quiet porch with a knitting woman whose simple words had changed the course of his life. The days went on, and the town continued its usual rhythm. But Daniels noticed subtle shifts in his interactions: colleagues, neighbors, strangers. He saw the world more clearly now, with compassion and patience guiding his actions. He knew he still had much to learn, but he also knew he had begun a path that mattered. And all the while, Mrs. Coleman continued her life quietly, unaware of the full effect her words and wisdom had on a young officer. She tended her garden, cared for the stray cats, and maintained her calm presence in the community. But through her patience, her stories, and her quiet strength, She had begun to shape a man who once saw the world only through rules and authority, teaching him instead to see it with understanding, fairness, and courage. Daniels knew that this journey would continue. There would be mistakes, moments of weakness, and challenges along the way. But he felt ready. The lessons of Mrs. Coleman and her husband were etched in him now, guiding him, reminding him, giving him the strength to act with honesty and compassion even when it was difficult. And as the sun set over the small town, casting long shadows across the streets, Officer Daniels felt a quiet peace he had never known. He was not the same man who had yelled at an elderly woman on a sunny afternoon. He was better because of her, because of her husband, because of the lessons lived and spoken with care, courage, and unwavering honesty.